All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to start our discussion on photosynthesis. So we're talking about cellular metabolism and really looking at sort of your overall carbon cycle, right? So we've been talking about cellular respiration happening in the mitochondria of cells, where we're taking in that glucose, taking in that oxygen, and ultimately making ATP so that we can do some sort of cellular work, and whether that's transporting things across the membrane, whether it's moving things around in the cells, whether it's energy to do chemical reactions, those cells need energy to work. Now, the byproducts of cellular respiration end up being the carbon dioxide in the water. So when we're tracing carbon throughout our ecosystems, that carbon comes in via glucose, goes through cellular respiration, back out as CO2, but then that CO2 in water ends up getting utilized in chloroplasts of photosynthesizers. So they'll take in energy from the sun, and they'll ultimately make the glucose and oxygen as byproducts of the photosynthesis process, and this whole cycle keeps on rolling. Now, when we talk about photosynthesizers, right, we're talking about autotrophs, and these are your major producers in your biosphere. When we talk about autotrophs, usually the first thing kids think about are plants. But that being said, plants are not the only ones who are capable of producing their own energy, producing their own food. We can look at algae in aquatic situations, we can look at other plants in aquatic situations, bacteria, and specifically if we're talking about autotrophs who do photosynthesis or some version of that, we're specifically talking about photoautotrophs as opposed to organisms who do chemosynthesis, in which case those guys would be the chemoautotrophs. Now, if we're talking about plants, we're talking about organisms who have chloroplasts. So when I look at the leaf of a plant, this is really what I'm looking at. I've got much more complex structure than most kids think about. So we've got this epidermal layer, so sort of like your skin. And then we also have this mesophyll layer, this middle layer of a leaf, and that's where the vast majority of your chloroplasts are found. We've also got xylem and phloem, so veins, like veins in your body that transport material, while these will also produce or transport water and nutrients and waste products to and from the leaf. So this is where most of your photosynthesis is happening. So when I look at the structure of an individual chloroplast, remember they've got a double membrane. So these guys used to be, we think, their own free-living cells. So that inner membrane would have been the membrane that came from the original prokaryote. Outer membrane would have been from the food vacuole that got created when that prokaryote got eaten by the other prokaryote. And then we also have these folds that take place inside your chloroplast as well. So when I look at smooth outer, smooth inner, and then I have this folded continuous inner membrane that we ultimately talk about as either a granum, which is an entire stack of these folds, kind of like to think of them like pancakes, so like your grand slam of your pancakes, that's the granum, and the individual pancakes or the individual folds are called thylakoids. And that thylakoid then also has space in between there, okay, so open space. If you, another food analogy, if you kind of like those, think of it like a pita pocket. So there's a literal pocket inside a thylakoid. That's that thylakoid space. And then surrounding those thylakoids is your stroma, which would essentially equate to the cytoplasm of any other cell. And just like the folds, the cristae of your mitochondria helps to increase surface area for your electron transport chain, the folds that we see here with these thylakoids are going to do the same thing. We're also going to come across an electron transport chain in photosynthesis as well. So when I look at the overall process of photosynthesis, just like you needed to memorize the balanced equation for cellular respiration, you also need to memorize the balanced equation for photosynthesis. Good news is, the only difference is flip the arrows and make sure you understand where the energy is. So for photosynthesis, we're going to take in 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water, along with energy from the sun, and that is ultimately going to produce us a single molecule of glucose plus 6 molecules of oxygen. So when I look at the overall process of photosynthesis, we have two major stages that are going to get linked by a bunch of energy molecules in the form of ATP and now NADPH. So another electron carrier, very similar to NADH in the mitochondria. Only difference is now there's an extra phosphate in here. So how do I remember which one goes with photosynthesis? Well, NADPH, pH for photosynthesis. That's how I remember this one goes with photosynthesis when the NADH goes with cellular respiration. So hopefully that helps. Now, I've got two major processes. So I've got my light reactions. Those guys are going to work first, and they're going to happen across that thylakoid membrane. They're also going to take in energy from the sun, water from the environment, and ultimately produce oxygen as a byproduct of their process. In addition, they're the reactions that are going to make the ATP and the NADPH. Now I'm going to need that energy then to drive this Calvin cycle. So it's going to look similar to the Krebs cycle in the sense that I'm going to take the original molecule that I put in here and recreate it to make this whole thing continually cycle through. The Calvin cycle is going to happen in our stroma, and it's going to take in that ATP and NADPH as energy sources from the light reactions. It's also going to take in CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's ultimately where we're going to produce sugars. In the process of using these energy molecules, though, I'm also going to break them back down, and so they'll get recycled back to the light reactions so that that energy continually can flow. Something else I'll point out while we're here is that you may come across the Calvin cycle, also called your dark reactions. It's sort of an older term, sort of getting phased out because it's kind of misleading. If I were to tell you dark reactions, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is that these happen at night. And that's not necessarily true. So in order for that Calvin cycle to continue to function, I need these energy molecules. How do I make them? Well, I need the energy from the sun to drive the light reactions to make them. Do you see what I'm getting at here? So although they used to be called the dark reactions because they don't directly utilize the light, they still happen during the daytime because I still need that ATP, I still need that NADPH, and I need sunlight energy to create those. So hopefully that makes sense.